This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland.
Saint Columba.
Rough Celtic saint.
He was a statesman, he was a pilgrim, he was a prophet.
If he was alive now, we'd all say he was a fanatic. There's descriptions of him wandering out into the sea to pray.
Columba, he was a very active man. He led a very full life and he achieved an enormous amount.
We can love this man because he does all sorts of fun things, like goes and fights the Loch Ness Monster.
He was allowed to start an Irish monastery on Iona, which of course is in modern-day Scotland.
Columba was part of Scotland becoming Christian.
His legacy is the Christian heritage of these islands and Scotland in particular.
His ultimate legacy would be the churches that still are in Scotland.
Columba, he's a Scottish saint.
Appreciate someone living their dream, and he really did. He pushed his vision, changed Scotland and the world.
I'm Paul Wright and welcome to the 5th programme of Back from the Brink, the series which investigates the role of the early medieval Irish in helping to save Western civilization. In our last programme, we heard how the Irish monk Columba, also known as Columcille, left Ireland in the year 563 AD to settle on the Scottish island of Iona and go on to establish monasteries throughout Western Scotland. We also heard how Iona became Columba's most famous monastery, as well as how the monks in such Irish monasteries lived very disciplined and tough lives. Iona-based early medieval historian Benjamin Cook.
The whole Celtic spirituality, their monastic orders were very, very disciplined. There was a superior who had that power over the brothers, and it was a hard charge for that person. It came with a requirement to love and care for their brothers. But at the same time, if they said jump, you jumped. You did what they asked, and it was part of their way of life to subject the body and then the will to the will, and then the will to the will of another, in order to subject themselves to Christ and be able to live what they saw as an imitation of the life of Christ, an imitation of that desert experience that Jesus went through after his baptism. And they strived their entire life to be able to achieve this. And that's something which we've kind of lost with our image of Friar Tuck and the happy-go-lucky monk. Isn't there? They weren't like that. They were much harder on themselves and expected much more of themselves.
It was very tough. I don't think we could stand up to it at all. I mean, this wading into the sea up to your chest and chanting all the psalms, which is a story told of different people, that was very demanding.
Celtic church historian Jan Such Picard.
And, sleeping on that, with your head on a rock, Columba's pillow, which is out there in the, did he sleep with his head on a rock? Was that because of the Old Testament story of Jacob, or was it just an extreme asceticism? And I suppose asceticism in itself, flagellation and all that, is not something that attracts me particularly, but when you see that out of that, as it were, denial of the flesh, such beautiful things came. There's a paradox there, isn't there? So I think it was a very tough life, but somehow the monks discovered another dimension, and that there was beauty in that dimension. But I think that they were very committed people.
And aside from prayer, farming and daily menial tasks, Celtic monks poured much energy into copying books and also creating new ones. Historian Benjamin Cook.
books were a thing of real value. And when we say a book, it's not our modern paperback, which is disposable and the corners bend. We're talking about a large leather-bound vellum tracts. These things represent a lot of hard work, a lot of effort, and a lot of exactitude in getting the copying precisely right. It wasn't just a case of pushing print on a printer. You had to copy each letter exactingly. And sometimes those working in the scriptoriums would not necessarily understand all the Latin they were copying. So it was this sort of something that was very precious, and they'd be heavily leather-bound and would be kept in a satchel. So it wouldn't just be a book, it would be a very large, heavy object that you could quite easily bludgeon someone with. You know, a lot of weight, a lot of energy, a lot of beauty and power, and a lot of magic to it. Reading would not just be a case of opening a book. It was something that only the few could do, and they'd produce them and they'd show them. And this is something Columba was really cared about and really brought to his monks. He not only taught them to recite large parts of the Bible, which they all did as part of their services, but also how to read and write and to understand this foreign language to them, Latin, that brought all of these stories to life and really was the fuel and the passion behind what they did and why they were here.
They copied out the gospel books, they copied out the Psalms and the Gospels laboriously and carefully. And Adovnan's life, Adovnan wrote 100 years after Columba. And it's a kind of hagiography, but there are lots of little details in Adovnan's life which show this activity of writing the books. There are stories about a clumsy guest who overset an inkhorn and spilled the ink. And the point that Adovnan's making is that Columba foresaw that this would happen and warned everyone, but the accident still happened. And there are stories about the monks proofreading. We know that they mixed oak gall to make their ink, and there have been traces of oak gall found when the archaeologists have been at work. So that whole making of books is a very significant part of their life. And of course, it's significant to us particularly because the Book of Kells began its life here in Iona.
Historian Jan Such-Pickard. And here's Lindisfarne-based Celtic Church historian Ray Simpson to share his views.
Columcille's monasteries were centres of art in the sense that the beautiful illuminated Gospels were works of art. The Book of Kells is often regarded as coming from the Columcille stable, and people argue as to whether it was produced at Iona and taken for safekeeping to Kells, or the Kells people like to think it was made there, of course. Who knows? But these had an enormous effect.
Staying with the genius of the Book of Kells, historian Nikki Scott of Historic Scotland shares her opinion.
Things like the Book of Kells, they are the culmination of these ideas, of this desire to preserve, to copy, to pass down the words of God. And I mean, the Book of Kells, it's described as being one of the most beautiful, glorious pieces of insular art. For my money, it's just one of the most beautiful pieces of art. Never mind the time period, never mind the country, never mind the form of it. It is just, my words cannot do it justice. It is simply one of the most beautiful things you could ever see. The stunning illustrations, the complexity of the illustrations, the care that went into producing these. Some of the illustrations you have to view with a magnifying glass to truly appreciate. So how the monks were able to create these, probably without those magnifying glasses, the dedication it reveals is just absolutely stunning. And really it's something you just can't describe. You have to go see it. It's stunning.
The Book of Kells is kind of the masterpiece, and it brings in artistic elements from all over the world. You can look at it and see elements from the Celtic Britons, from the Pictish style of doing things, but also from the Byzantine, from the high cultures of Greece. from Rome that was, and these elements carrying through in the artistry that's in there, and these sort of very iconic style images that really stare out of the page at you.
Historian Benjamin Cook. Here's Nicky Scott of Historic Scotland once again.
Really, these were periods where not just sort of scholarly knowledge, but also we look at something like the Book of Kells, and it's artistic knowledge, artistic skill. There's immense artistic skill and interest in art. You don't go to all that trouble of producing these fabulous illuminated manuscripts, of carving these fantastic high crosses, if you're not interested in things that are not only glorying God, but are beautiful and are using that beauty to glorify God.
I think it was Gerald Cambrensis, was it, of Wales, who said that the Book of Kells must have been written by an angel.
Historian Ray Simpson.
I think it's an amazing quality of colours, and they got the materials for these colours from as far away as, I think, Afghanistan and Persia, as it was then, and as well as things that they grew, and egg yolk and all sorts of things were used. So it was probably the first time in Ireland or Britain that this amazing collection of colouring was brought together in one place, because they had this idea that nothing in the world could be as important as the Gospels, and so the very finest and most beautiful work should be done on them.
One of the wonderful things about the Book of Kells, it does invite you to just go off on tangents and really sort of wax lyrical about it, because it is so beautiful. I mean, it's the aesthetics of it. I mean, it just, even without reading the text of the Gospel that it contains, in and of itself, it is just such a beautiful object. And I mean, so that in itself tells us that they were concerned, the producers were concerned with making it a beautiful object. They wanted to make it as aesthetically pleasing as they could, so it was obviously something that was displayed, but it makes you can't stop yourself from sort of rambling on about it, because it is so beautiful. Such a beautiful object, so carefully produced. You know, there's not lots of crossings out and deletions that you find in a lot of other medieval manuscripts. So the beauty of it was obviously something that was of prime concern, and you really just you just can't almost contain yourself because it's such a lovely thing, such a lovely thing.
I like to quote Bishop Irenaeus, who after all was a kind of leader of a Celtic church 2 or 3 centuries before. The glory of God is seen through a human life lived to the full. Now, they may not have known that quote, but I think they lived that idea. So art was part of the glory of the human being. So was the long hair, which is why the Irish monks kept their hair long, so when the Roman monks shaved it off. Let's have these glorious things. Let's have a riot of colour. Let's have a religion that flows with creation in its shapes and its forms and its feel. Let's have poetry and song. There's a sense of life being at its fullness. And we ourselves are a work of art in the making.
In many ways, it was a grueling art form. You have to prepare all of your inks by hand. You have to prepare all of your vellum by hand. You know, you have to get that all ready. So it's not just a case of you sit down with pen and paper and you write. You sit down and you make your pen and you make your paper and you make your ink, and then you might think about writing.
Early medieval historian Benjamin Cook.
They really did work very carefully in making sure that all the detailing was correct. A common thing that you see with later medieval psalters and prayer books is that you start with a lot of money and you get these beautiful elaborate opening pages, and by the time you get to the back of the book, the decorations got simpler or disappeared altogether. This wasn't the case with the kind of high point, the Book of Kells, and these early monastic ones. They really pushed beauty into every inch of those pages, but it would have been a very grueling task.
It's easy for us with our central heating and our armchairs to romanticise. I think it was a hard work. It was a work of the will, dedication, perseverance. Many cold, dark winter days, but they persevered. How they kept their hands straight, from the fingers from trembling, I don't know. They had, of course, quills. I think they dedicated their fingers to the Holy Spirit of God and saw it as a divine work. I suppose parts of what kept them going was this feeling that they were dedicated to the High King of the whole world. Now, in the tribes, you do what the king said. They had a superior boss, the High King of the whole world. So it wasn't all romantic and lovey-dovey. I think a lot of it was sheer grit, hard work, dedication. But for a great end, because they were building colonies of heaven, the kingdom of God was being created on earth.
But for many of them, it was more than just a copying physical task. It was a devotional activity. It was a way of connecting with the faith of the past and what would be the faith of the future, and being that linchpin in the present, preserving things and copying things for the future that may never mean that much to you. I mean, if they sat down and copied out a treatise on the history of the Roman Empire, it's probably not something they were overly interested in, although some of them may have been. We know of scholars like Bede who were very excited about what they found in their libraries, but their sense that they were preserving the past for the future and giving the future a great gift, and particularly with their religious texts, particularly with their beautiful artwork that enchanted future generations and encouraged them to read more.
While I was working here, I had a sabbatical. On the sabbatical, I went to see the Book of Kells, but I didn't go straight there, which wouldn't have taken very long. I went via a number of different libraries where I looked at medieval manuscripts, and as I travelled on, I discovered all sorts of things. One of the places I went to was a place called Saint Gallen in Switzerland.
Jan Such-Pickard, historian and also former warden of the Iona community in Scotland.
Now, St Gallen is a beautiful Baroque monastery. Into it were gathered all sorts of manuscripts that are much older, some of which were written on the island of Reichenau, which is in the Rhine. And that was one of the places that the wandering Irish monks came to, Columbanus, and, well, St Gallen as well. I stood in this library in St Gallen, and I was looking at the manuscripts spread out there under glass. And in one of them, there was I think it was a genealogy. It was not a very exciting bit, it wasn't a bit of the gospel itself, but it was a genealogy, and it had been written out carefully in the uncial script, in Latin, of course, because that was the church language that the monks used. And then suddenly, in the bottom corner of the page, the same hand that has been writing out so carefully this ecclesiastical information breaks into something quite different. Little short lines in Gaelic. What's this? It's a poem. What's the poem? It's Pangaban. It is the poem about the monk and his cat, the monk in the scriptorium working away, and the cat busily catching mice, just as the monk is catching words and trapping them and putting them down on the page. And throughout my childhood, that was such a beautiful picture of the monk and his cat side by side in the busyness of the scriptorium, and yet a sort of reflective space as well, where the monk could say, well, we're each doing God's work. And there, lo and behold, I actually found the poem that had influenced me as a child written down in this library in Switzerland. Of course, I wasn't reading it in the Gaelic, and this is one translation of it. I and Pangaban, my cat, 'tis a like task we are at. Hunting mice is his delight, hunting words I sit all night. Better far than praise of men 'tis to sit with book and pen. Pangur bears me no ill will, he too plies his simple skill. 'Tis a merry thing to see at our tasks how glad are we, when at home we sit and find entertainment to our mind. Oftentimes a mouse will stray in the hero Pangur's way. Oftentimes my keen thought set takes a meaning in its net. 'Gainst the wall he sets his eye, full and fierce and sharp and sly. 'Gainst the wall of knowledge I all my little wisdom try. When a mouse darts from his den, oh, how glad is Pangur then! Oh, what gladness do I prove when I solve the doubts I love! So in peace our tasks we ply, Pangaban, my cat, and I. In our arts we have our bliss, I have mine and he has his. Practice every day has made Pangur perfect in his trade. I get wisdom day and night, turning darkness into light. And I think this concept of turning darkness into light, that says a lot about what the monks felt they were at. And a light for Europe, for a light for their own communities, and a light that spread wider and wider. And that's a beautiful thought.
I and Pangaban, my cat, 'tis like a task we are at. Hunting mice is his delight, hunting words I sit all night. 'Tis a merry thing to see, at our task how glad are we, when at home we sit and find entertainment to our mind. Against the wall he sets his eye, full and fierce, sharp and sly. Against the wall of knowledge I all my little wisdom try. So in peace our tasks we ply, Pangaban, my cat and I. In our arts we find our bliss. I have mine and he has his. I have mine and he has his.
But it wasn't just in creating new horizons in learning and the arts that Celtic monks such as Columba excelled. Columba himself personally spearheaded a mission among the pagan Picts of Scotland to try convert them to the Christian faith. He was pragmatic enough to realise that no mission among them would succeed without the support of the number one Pictish king of that time, King Brut. Glasgow-based early medieval historian David Traynor.
It was very dangerous, and the Picts were a dangerous people, and for them to travel there, they would have had to have some kind of either a recognition or permission from the local lord or king or whatever. But also there was the other thing that the monks at that time, in Columba's day, the monks wore a particular type of tonsure. They shaved the front of their head, so that the top of their head was bald. The hair at the back was really, really long, round down the back, and they were clean shaven. There was no moustache and no beard. And this was the way the Druid priests, that's how they cut their hair. And this gave them a lot of clout because they would have the air of Druid priests about them. So these holy men, they had this aura that would have given them a bit of clout when they're moving into these places.
Either way, I think it does show a bit of bravery to go out into an area where you're not entirely sure if you're welcome.
Historian Nicky Scott of Historic Scotland.
We have some evidence that the Picts, at least some of them, were beginning to accept Christian ideas early on, perhaps even earlier than Columba. But it still wasn't a widespread Christian community. There was still very entrenched, I suppose, what we would call pagan beliefs. So really, he can't be sure if he's welcome. Certainly other missionaries that go out into other areas have paid with their lives for going into areas where they weren't sure if they're welcome, and became martyrs for their cause. So for him to go out and venture and try and preach the Christian word, to even if it was to some areas which were already converted, was a very brave thing to do.
Certainly, Columba's mission was something new for the Picts. It was a major step forwards. Obviously, for a long time, there'd been trade between Ireland and the west coast of the Hebrides, trade right the way up Scotland, and the sea routes were really the way in, the thoroughfares. So going across Scotland's highlands was actually a lot easier than it is now. Where we travel by road, all of the lochs get in your way. When you travel by loch, they just carry you straight the way across. So he from here could make inroads up the big sea lochs right the way into the Pictish kingdoms and travelled to see these monarchs. And because he himself was of a royal line, was a prince of Dalriada, he was able to get into these courts and into these circles in a way that others were not able to do.
Historian Benjamin Cook. Here's Ray Simpson once again.
He was always thinking big. He was a statesman of the kingdom of God. He looked out to the Picts to the north. He walked up the great glen up the side of Loch Ness.
And to hear how Columba of Iona fared in his mission among the pagan Picts, including how he warded off an attack by the Loch Ness monster, and much more, then make sure to catch our next number 6 programme in this 12-part Back from the Brink series. This programme was made with the support of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. Songs by Cliff Wedgbury. From myself, Paul Wright, bye for now.